Hello, everyone. It's great to be back at Republica this year, talking to you about data centers this time. Hopefully you know what a data center is. If not, we will get into it. But yeah, and so we're talking not just about data centers, but the growing response to them, the growing backlash to them in some places. We'll dig into it. But I want to start with a little story. And so this guy here, this is Chris Sacca. You might not recognize him, and that is completely OK, because he turned up in a city called The Dalles in Oregon in the western United States in 2005, claiming to represent a company called Design LLC. And this was a town that usually had an industrial base. I think it was steel that they used to make, and that was kind of winding down. The refinery there had closed, and they were looking for some new industry that was going to bring them into the future. And so Chris showed up, and he said, "Hey, my company, Design LLC, is looking to build a data center here in the Dalles. What do you think about that? It would bring you into the 21st century. It would modernize your economy." And the city there, they were excited about it, right? This was a move into the digital future. It was 2005 that was just taking off. And they thought it would really get them in on the ground floor. But he said, in order to do this, my company, Design LLC, is going to need some special sweeteners to make it so that we can set it up here. So he asked for guaranteed cheap power, fiber internet that the city would have to build out and make sure was available for the data center, 15 years of property tax breaks, so it wouldn't have to pay those property taxes for quite a long time, a lot of water, and secrecy around what they were actually doing. This required some approval from the governor to do some of these things, the governor of the state of Oregon, but eventually it moved forward. And of course, there started to be questions. What is this company, Design LLC? What is it actually doing? I hadn't heard of a company that was doing something like that. Well, of course, it wasn't Design LLC. It was Google using a different name. And this was the first data center that they had set up. This has become something that a lot of these companies use, and using a different name to get some deals and then reveal themselves as the one behind these different projects. So over the years, Google started building this first data center in 2006 and has built a number of others as it's expanded its footprint in the Dalles. But the Dalles, even though you can see here on this bottom picture that there is a river running through the community, it's not actually a community that gets a lot of water and that has a lot of water to spare. It's on the side of Oregon, which is actually more of a desertic place, which doesn't get a lot of rain. And of course, it relies on the river in order to supply the water for what goes on around it. And so as Google's data centers began to expand over time, there were growing questions as to the amount of water that this company was sucking up, the amount of water that it was using. And so in 2021, it came up for, Google had to make a new deal for its availability of water. And people started to ask, does it make sense to be giving this major company that keeps wanting to grow its footprint here the access to our, very limited and scarce water? And so, the people of the community started asking more and more questions, started wanting answers from their local elected officials, and wanted to know, actually, how much water Google was actually using. And when the Oregonian, one of the local newspapers, went to the state and went to the city and tried to ask for that information, they weren't given it. Instead, they were sued. But to ensure that they wouldn't get access to that information, because remember, one of the things that Chris Sacca asked for back in 2005 was secrecy around Google's operations there. And so they did not want to share that information, so they launched a lawsuit in order to try to stop the information around water use from being shared. And Google, of course, was paying the legal bills to make sure that that wouldn't happen. But about a year later, after a lot of public pressure, and as the kind of PR nightmare was escalating around this attempt to fight the disclosure of the amount of water that it was using, because nearby data centers from Amazon and from Apple had no problem telling people how much water they were using, but for some reason Google didn't want to. And so eventually Google relented and released its figures. And what people found was that Google's water use in the Dalles had actually tripled over the last 5 years as it had been growing its footprint. 355 million gallons, or 1.34 billion liters of water it was using a year in order to cool its data centers. That was actually 29% of the entire water use of that city that Google was eating up, and of course it wanted to keep using more. And on top of that, it had received $260 million in tax breaks, or at least that much, over that period of time. And of course, it was planning to expand its footprint, so that would mean more water use into the future. And people were not so sure about that, to the degree that some residents even started calling Google a water vampire, because it really wanted to suck up these resources that the city relied on, and that, of course, the residents needed, right, for other things like farming. And they also just wanted to protect the river itself and the salmon and the other species that live there, right? They didn't just want to dry up this river by feeding these data center projects. So this was, a real moment in the growing discussion around data centers, the impacts that they have, the resources that they use, and it plays into a bigger picture of what we're starting to see today. So if you're not familiar with data centers, these are some photos of what a data center actually looks like. Data centers are not a wholly new thing. They have been around since the early days of computation. As people needed centralized areas to put all of these computers and to put what was happening. But there was a real shift in the early 2000s, again, right around the time that Google was going to build that data center in the Dalles, where companies like Google and Amazon and Microsoft started investing in what we now call cloud computing. And this is basically massive kind of centralized data processing that happens in these incredibly large facilities that we now call hyperscale data centers, right? Because it's not just a set of computers or server racks that's in an office. It's these massive warehouses stuffed full of servers that are really part of the backbone and part of the key operating functions of the internet today. And so one of these hyperscale data centers, the kind of judgment, the minimum is about 100,000 square feet or 900 square meters, and they can hold up to at least 5,000 servers. But that is really on the low end. That was like the early days of when they were getting started with these things. Amazon, for example, its data centers now have usually about 50,000 servers in one building. And of course, these companies are pushing continually to grow them and grow them and grow them. And just so you know what you're looking at here. This is a Meta data center in Iowa. This one here is an Amazon data center in Oregon. This one is another Amazon data center in Virginia, which is Virginia in the United States is a big hub for data centers because it's near where the military is to get access to government contracts. And this one here is a Microsoft data center in the Netherlands, which of course is one of the places where there's been a lot of increasing backlash to the data centers. And so, you could say, okay, this is, sure, these are big facilities, but, there's only a few of them around the world. It's not a big deal. They're not, pulling up so much other than these few communities where they're located in. Well, that's where this is changing. So in 2018, Synergy Research Group said that there were 430 hyperscale data centers in the world. By 2020, that had grown to 597. And of course, just so you know, about half of those are controlled by Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. And about 40% in 2020 were in the United States, but there's a growing push to expand the international footprint. By mid-2023, that was at 926 data centers. So you can see, kind of the rapid escalation here in the number of hyperscale data centers that are being built and established. At the time that report was released in mid-2023, Synergy estimated there were at least 427 hyperscale data centers under construction at the time. And what we have seen, if you've been kind of paying attention to the news recently, the data center news, is that there have been a lot of major investments that have been happening by companies like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google to build many more hyperscale data centers around the world. These are all, just a selection of news stories about investments made in the past few months in places around the world of over $1 billion to build major new data centers all around the planet. And the reason why this is a big deal is that the amount of kind of hyperscale data center capacity is poised to triple over the next 6 years. And of course, that is being driven not just by, kind of standard usage stuff, but in particular by the generative AI and the other AI tools that these companies are really trying to roll out in this moment, because the models behind those things require a lot of energy, a lot of computing power in order, to make them work, right? In order to make them function. And what these companies want to do is to roll out those tools in many more places, and that means that they need a lot more computing power in order to power those things. And so, no surprise, what we're seeing around the world is a growing opposition to the construction of these data centers because, they're not only taking up a lot of land, but they're also sucking a lot of resources, like in the Dals. And so this is, of course, a protest that happens in Ireland, which is a big site that we'll talk about more in a second. The Netherlands over here, which has been protesting data centers quite vigorously. And these are from some protests in the United States. And so, the real opposition here is not just to data centers for no reason, but is really around often the energy use and the water use. Because if you think about these massive facilities that are stuffed full of computers, we all know that computers get pretty hot when they're running, right? And so when you have all of these servers together in one space, that creates a lot of heat, and so you need a lot of energy or a lot of water, depending on the type of cooling that you're using, in order to cool those things down. And so that is what these communities are really concerned about, because as the number of data centers grows, the suck on the resources continues to increase. So we'll go through those one at a time. So with water use, it's difficult to get the exact numbers. Sometimes the companies can be a bit cagey about what actually goes on in their data centers. But based on Google data centers, we know that on average, they use about 550,000 gallons of water a day, or 2.1 million liters. And annually, it's about 200 million gallons, or 760 million liters, that goes into cooling one of these data centers, depending on where they're built and if they're really relying on, this is the average, right? So it can be above that, it can be a bit below that. And what we've seen is that Google's water use has actually increased by 20% in 2022, so over 2021. And this is a notable figure for two reasons, right? On the one hand, you have, a 20% increase just in 1 year over the other, but this is the year before generative AI really took off, right? We saw that really take off through 2023. We know that that requires a lot more computing power than the types of tools that they were rolling out in the past. We know that they have been pushing to increase their data center network significantly over the past year and a half. And so we can imagine that when we get the 2023 numbers, that is going to be quite a significant jump. And of course, for Microsoft, which is very much in this game as well, in 2022, its water use was up 34% above the 2021 numbers. And this is just not overall this is not overall water use. This is specifically for its data centers. So, it's these sorts of numbers that is getting communities concerned. And part of that is because in some parts of the world, these companies are really focused on, minimizing the cost of running these things. And so they'll stick these data centers in really arid places, really desertic places, because the power is cheap. But then they need a lot of water from these places that don't have a lot of water to spare in order to cool them down. Places like Spain, places like Arizona in the United States, places like desertic areas of South America, where they're sticking these data centers and then taking water from the local communities that can't really spare all of that water. In particular, there's an example in Chile. This is a sign from protesters down there because Google wanted to build a data center in Cerrillos, which is on the outskirts of Santiago. It's a working class neighborhood. And they had actually not too recently been connected to running water, from pipes for the first time in their lives. They had previously relied on trucked water. And so Google arrived and said, we want to build this massive data center here. But they weren't really willing to give the community very much information, very much detail around what kind of impacts on the community this would have and what amount of a draw it was going to have on the local resources. And so they mobilized against this data center to stop it because they were concerned that Google's data center was going to require so much water from their community that they were going to be pushed off of water flowing into their homes and be pushed back onto relying on trucks in order to receive their water. And they were not willing to have that happen to them. And Google was not willing to give them the reassurances to make them believe that that wouldn't happen. And so that data center was ultimately paused. And what we saw after that was Google moved on to Uruguay and proposed a very similar data center there. And immediately, those protests flared up again, especially because at that time, Uruguay was experiencing a drought, had very little water to offer, and they were not willing to hand that water over to a company like Google to do what they want. And of course, if you don't read Spanish, this first sign here says, danger, no data center, data theft. Of course, that's another concern about what these companies are doing with our data more broadly. And this one here from Uruguay says, water is not given away, it is not sold, it is defended. And that is what they were determined to do. So these are the types of protests that we start to see around the world. But then, of course, there's the question of energy use as well. So globally right now, data centers account for about 2 to 3% of global energy use. That can seem pretty low, but it's more than like aviation and some other things. Emissions as well, similar to around 2 to 3% based on the numbers that I've seen. In the United States, it's about 5% of emissions come from data centers because the United States tends to have more than other parts of the world, at least for now. But again, that is significantly growing. And what we have seen is that there is significant growth that is happening here and projected to continue happening. So the International Energy Agency estimates that in 2022, data centers, AI, and cryptocurrencies globally were using 460 terawatt hours, which is just a little below what the country of France uses. And that by 2026, they estimate the amount of energy use required for data centers, AI, and cryptocurrencies is going to be 1,050 terawatt hours, which is about the amount of the country of Japan. So that is a significant, almost doubling over the course of 4 years, in order to power these things that these tech companies want us to adopt, right? The types of tools, the AI tools in particular, that they want to roll out into the world, whether we want to use those things or not, because it works for their business models. And so again, we see these protests against data centers based on energy as well. These are protests in Ireland. I think that they have some of the best anti-data center propaganda that you can find in some other places. So of course, calling them energy vampires, whether it's Amazon or Google or Meta. And of course, Ireland has become a major site for data centers in Europe, in part because of the tax arrangements that it has. So it has a lot of the tech companies who are operating there. But of course, the access to data cables, fiber optic cables, all these sorts of things are part of the reason that these companies set up data centers in Ireland. So at the moment, you saw I said about 2 to 3% globally of energy goes toward data centers. In Ireland, that is 18%. So 18% of the country's power goes to powering data centers. The International Energy Agency estimates that could be up to a third of their total power by 2026. And so you can understand why people in Ireland are not willing to have this happen, right? Are not willing to have these data centers continue to be built out in their country when it's not clear what benefit they are actually getting out of that. Around Dublin, there has been a moratorium on data center construction because they simply could not keep up with the demand for energy in order to keep powering these new data centers being constructed. That, of course, caused the companies to start building data centers in other parts of the country. And we've also seen moratoriums of various lengths in Singapore and the Netherlands as well. And then, it's not just, the question of how much energy these data centers are using and these tech companies are using. There are broader impacts to that as well. So in in Sweden, Amazon and Microsoft have been building a lot of data centers up there. And we've seen in communities like Malmö and Katrineholm that businesses that I think people would be, more likely to want to have in their communities because they provide some sort of tangible benefit like meat processing centers or bakeries, and not to mean like a storefront bakery, but the actual plant that creates a lot of the bread that people would consume, have not been able to set up in those communities because the data centers demanded so much power and they've had to go and construct them elsewhere. So it actually kind of pushes these businesses out to other areas because the data centers have such high resource and energy demands. And then on top of that, New Zealand, or Aotearoa, using the indigenous name for that country, they have also seen Amazon and Microsoft setting up a lot of data centers down there. And their concern, was less about, okay, it's going to push other businesses away, but more about meeting their climate commitments. Because these data centers demand so much energy in order to power them, they were saying, okay, we're in the process of trying to build up these renewable energy sources so that we can take the fossil fuels off of the grid, to meet our commitments under the Paris Accord and other things, so that we're not contributing as much emissions. But in order to power these data centers, it's going to be harder to shut down those fossil fuel generating sources, and we're going to need more power overall. So this is going to delay our ability to actually reduce our emissions and meet our climate targets. And does it really make sense when these data centers are not so much to serve the New Zealand public, but are just part of these larger data center networks that these companies are building out in order to serve an international market? And we see that in other places as well. In Kansas and other parts of the United States, energy regulators have had to keep fossil fuel power plants operating in order to power the growing demands for data centers, cryptocurrencies, and things like that. And so this is a growing issue, right? It's not just about the amount of power, but it's about the the impacts of demanding all of that power and how that actually affects what these countries can do, whether they can meet climate goals, whether other businesses that they deem more important can set up, and ultimately, what their power grid is going to look like. And so this is important for a very key reason. This is Sam Altman. You've probably seen his face quite a bit over the past year and a half. He's the CEO of OpenAI, which makes ChatGPT, DALL-E, these other products that we've become very familiar with over the past year or so. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland in January, he was interviewed by Bloomberg, and he said this: "We do need way more energy in the world than I think we thought we needed before. We still don't appreciate the energy needs of this technology. I still expect, unfortunately, the world is on a path where we're going to have to do something dramatic with climate, like geoengineering as a stopgap." So essentially in this interview, he was arguing that we're going to need a lot more power in order to allow this vision of AI that he wants to see actually roll out into the world, right? Where AI is going to be implemented into everything, that's going to be very beneficial for his company, and that's going to have a lot of computation, but also water, energy, and other resource demands that are going to come with it. And so that energy breakthrough that he envisions is a nuclear energy breakthrough, but recognizing that we're on this short timeline because of the pressures presented by the climate crisis, that energy breakthrough needs to come pretty quick. And if it doesn't, which he recognizes it probably won't, then he just says, oh, instead of reassessing my vision of what AI is going to be and what the future of technology is going to be, we'll just have to geoengineer the planet so I can keep doing whatever I want. And of course, geoengineering the planet is a very risky endeavor that a lot of people are very opposed to, scientists, of course, for very good reason. And so that brings us to the question of who ultimately makes the decisions around these things, right? Is the decision around the technologies that we adopt, the data centers that we build, the amount of compute that we need, left to these billionaires like Sam Altman or Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft, which funds a lot of what OpenAI does, and of course these other billionaires who are behind Google and Microsoft and these other major companies. In order to power their business models, in order to do what they think is best for their companies, their ability to increase their profits, their revenue, and their market share? Or is that left up to democratic publics and to communities who are actually affected by these technologies in order to decide what technologies and how much compute we actually need in order to, realize technology that works for the social good rather than just what's best for the commercial interests of these various companies? And I think as these data center networks continue to grow, that is a question that is going to face us more and more. And ultimately, it leads us to the deepest question of all, which is how much compute do we actually need in order to build socially beneficial technologies that help to improve our world rather than just being focused on what is best for these massive companies that we increasingly recognize have these really large negative externalities and harms that they create in the world because they're so focused on just doing what works best for them rather than thinking about, how their technologies actually benefit the larger public. And so I think these are key questions that we need to be asking ourselves as we see the pressure increase to build more and more data centers, hyperscale data centers around the world that have these major energy, water, and resource demands. And of course, to ask, what is an alternative? What could an alternative look like? And do we ultimately really need all of these data centers that these companies are looking to build? So thank you so much. I think we have time for some questions if anyone wants to ask anything. But thanks for listening.
Hello? Yeah. Hi. Thanks again. Now, you had the question at the very end. Would you have a suggestion for an answer?
I would say I'm working on the answer. I'm still in the process of researching this, and so I think that the issue of the amount of water and the amount of energy that these data centers require is huge, and the number of data centers that these companies are trying to build out. And I think the ultimate question is, first of all, are these incredibly computationally intensive technologies the ones that we actually need in order to try to improve what is going on in our world, or is this just really about them trying to increase the power that they have over what we're doing, and we kind of need to pay the ultimate price for that by creating the compute and giving up the resources necessary in order to do it. So yeah, I would like to know more about that, and it's what I plan to look into more.
What else? My thought would be for the energy part, much of that could be solved by renewable ones.
Yeah.
Of course, one might question how intense you need the computing. But on the other hand, I think the more serious question would be the water.
Yeah, definitely. And even on the renewables, that's part of the issue, right? In places like New Zealand and Ireland, that's what they're finding is they're trying to build out all these renewables, but the increasing energy demand of these data centers is so high that they can't keep up fast enough, so they need to keep the fossil fuels running as well, right? So yeah, definitely important. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Anke Domscheit-Berg. I'm interested in knowing about the other resources because the hardware usually is exchanged very fast, very often. So what happens to all the tons of hardware? Where do the materials come from and what impact does that have? Have you looked into that too?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I was going to try to fit it into the presentation, but I was like, okay, I'm trying to keep it to 25 minutes. I'll keep it to energy and water, and we'll stop there. But you're completely right. There's so many other resources that go into this. Of course, we think about the computer hardware, and in order to create that computer hardware, we need to mine a lot of minerals in order to make it. And then, as you say, a lot of these, whether it's GPUs or CPUs or these other things that are in these data centers, they actually get recycled out quite often because they're so heavily used. And so that ultimately creates quite a lot of e-waste because we don't have the degree of recycling that is necessary in order to reuse a lot of these materials. And even on that point, that recycling process is very chemically intensive, has its own issues with it. So yeah, these are issues that we need to deal with. I don't think we're going to get rid of like computation altogether or anything. So that means that we need to address these deeper problems. But do we need to have it on this scale, and does this make it particularly ungovernable? That's I think an open question.
Can you hear me? Oh, you can hear me. Paris, this is excellent. I listen to your podcast all the time.
Thanks.
I also think about this quite a lot. So one of the things that I keep thinking about is that the move towards privacy could change this. So right now, it's all focused and it's on centralized systems pretty much. If you have a more distributed system where we are using much more local computation, then it might help. I'm not saying it will help completely, but I think that's the way to go. And I think the law and pushing and consumers starting to go, actually, I don't want this stuff to be handled in the cloud, can really help with this. Thoughts?
Definitely. No, I agree with you, right? And I think the key is that if we're going to make a shift toward kind of more distributed computing and rethinking the foundations of the technologies that we actually use, it can't just be, okay, we still want to do all the stuff we're doing now, but distributed, because that would still have an intense, computational demand. And now, like, everyone is trying to spring up their own data centers in order to power it all. But to actually question fundamentally, as that shift is happening, okay, which of these technologies do we need to keep in order to, be beneficial to us, and which ones do we don't actually need because that just, is based on benefiting these companies at the end of the day, and we can kind of get rid of it all. But yeah, key point, and I think we should be definitely moving in that direction. Thank you so much, everybody.